It was 1 p.m. when the train with Flight Lieutenant Jens Müller and Sergeant Per Bergsland arrived in Szczecin. The station was teeming with life, and if not for German uniforms, one would think that the war hadn't reached this place. On the platform, they experienced a very tense and dangerous situation. A youngster of the Hitlerjugend bumped into Bergsland intentionally. This could unnecessarily attract unwanted attention and jeopardize the success of the escape. The young German, luckily, only did it out of boredom while he was waiting for a train. Per was petrified. Müller realized that his mental condition was not very good, and he had to leave him alone for a while on the platform while he went to the gents. The previous night's traumatic experiences, the cramped 100-meter-long tunnel into which they had to climb down about 9 meters, then a sleepless night, the German patrol, and the incident on the platform made him even more stressed and paranoid. The air raid sirens and the disappearance of the sergeant baffled him completely when he came back. Pushed by a German soldier who was shouting straight into his ear, he passed the point where Per was supposed to be waiting for him. It crossed his mind that the sergeant had been arrested, and now they may be observing him and capture him at any time. He knew that running toward the bunker would put him in even more danger. Only Germans were allowed into the bunker. He couldn't turn back, and yet he was lucky. Nobody checked his ID. Apparently, the alarm also surprised the Germans. In pre-war analysis of military specialists, it had been underlined that Szczecin had a great strategic importance, and the fact that it could be a city free of the enemy's raids. But as early as June 1940, the first British aircraft appeared above the city. Flight Lieutenant Jens Müller was thinking of the sergeant. In his head, many possible plots were spinning around, each one coming up with a different version of what might have happened to Bergsland, when suddenly a familiar object caught his eye: the suitcase. The suitcase belonged to Per. So the lost had been found. The Norwegians' most important task was now to be done. Firstly, the topography of the city. They had to recognize what they had learned about Szczecin in the camp while they were preparing for the escape. In the evening, they were to meet someone in the old town part of the city, a person who was going to smuggle them to the harbor and then on to neutral Sweden. On hearing about a mass escape of POWs from Stalag Luft III, Adolf Hitler got furious and intended to execute them all immediately. However, Göring was against his decision because he was sure that the solution would be impossible to keep secret. Hitler gave orders to execute more than half of those captured. Himmler suggested 50. The main Reich Safety Office announced a hunt.
Sie sind endlich fertig?
Jawohl, immer, Herr Kommissar.
Perfekt. Ich diktiere.
Every day, German police issued an article in an internal newspaper, Deutsches Kriminalblatt, titled "A Mass Escape of Royal Air Force Officers from POW Camp Luft III in Szczecin." The Criminal Police Bulletin announced that 76 Royal Air Force officers escaped on the night of the 24th and 25th of March from Luft III in Szczecin, through a tunnel which was probably 100 meters long. Most of them were British, but there are other nationalities serving with the Royal Air Force. Deutsches Kriminalblatt was used as a kind of instruction for the procedures of all the services and troops engaged in the great hunt within the whole area of Germany. They were searching from the Baltic Sea as far as the Alps, from the East Prussia as far as occupied France, Belgium, and Holland. After 2 hours of wandering around the Odre River, they knew where the historical city center was, their meeting place. Unfortunately, it was still too light to go there. When they stopped by a street photographer, the lieutenant noticed a restaurant. The only things they had in their suitcases were food rations and German marks. They needed a hot meal without the necessity of having food coupons. Unfortunately, there was nobody inside. They quickly learned that a hot meal for strangers during the war was impossible. They could only get beer there. They decided to spend as much time there as possible. The lieutenant was trying to calculate calmly. It was still too light outside. They could go out and accidentally bump into a patrol. The bartender kept staring at them. Then a brilliant idea crossed Jens' mind. A cinema seemed to be a perfect place. It could solve a problem of waiting for 2 hours. Actually, the cinema wasn't very crowded, but at least it was dark and they could rest a bit. On the screen, the German propaganda newsreel was praising the advantages of the Odre River transportation, flowing across Szczecin toward the Baltic Sea.
An der Oder arbeitet ohne Unterbrechung der Hafen und die anglo-amerikanischen Terrorangriffe. Dank der Oder und der Lage der Stadt können die Szczeciner ruhig schlafen. Allein der Blick der Kulissen alleine. Die Oder hat uns nie enttäuscht, wird uns nie enttäuschen. Das weiß ich.
After leaving the cinema and trying to avoid open spaces, the Norwegians had to get to Old Town and find Kleine Oderstrasse. They knew already that this street was infamous for its bad reputation. The neighborhood was deserted. The view of the streets was varied. Some houses seemed to be untouched while others were lifeless. The smell of burning was in the air. In the distance, they could see huge open spaces with the remains of bombed houses. They could feel that their safety depended only on pure luck. In the meantime, they were continuously sending messages in the form of the Criminal Police newspaper, which dealt with the Great Escape. The paper announced that over 10 POWs had been captured and jailed in Szczecin. Because one common direction for the escapers had not been found, the hunt had to be executed in all districts with equal care. It was not difficult to find the address quickly, but there was no answer. There was no chance they had made a mistake. Suddenly, out of the gate, a man walked out. He asked if they needed anything and whether they had anything to sell. He quickly suggested exchanging cigarettes for bread. He wanted to win him over. In the end, the lieutenant had the feeling that the man was their only chance, so he asked if he had known Swedish sailors. On hearing those words, the man went away quickly. The Norwegians were ready to flee when suddenly the man appeared with a Swedish sailor. The Norwegians told him the whole story of the escape. The Swede did not want to believe initially. He thought the Norwegians were pulling his leg. But the lieutenant did not look like a liar. The sailor decided to smuggle them on board his ship somehow. He told them to come again at 10 p.m. and show them the way. They were to meet at the French brothel, which the Germans never visit. Jens and Per had another few hours to wait. The Norwegians arrived a half an hour before time. They knew that Germans didn't go to the French brothel, but they were afraid they could have been set up by undercover Gestapo.
Salut l'amour.
Two French women walked in. One of them was the madam. Could they have something in common with smuggling escapees across the harbor? The lieutenant was anxiously awaiting the Swede. The innocent sergeant's face must have awakened some sympathy of two Czech girls, who immediately showed their interest. Despite the war and bombing, the business was flourishing. The Swede didn't appear. Jens wanted to leave and think of a plan B. But the sergeant, as if had forgotten why they were there. The lieutenant decided to use the situation and look for the Swede downstairs. His intuition was right. The Swede was just about to leave.
Pourquoi?
They started to walk along Kleine Oderstrasse toward the railway station. This time the newspaper reported that the escapees were mostly wearing civilian clothes made of Royal Air Force uniforms. All the captured escapees had papers for French, Czech, or Norwegian workers. The papers were partly or fully forged on a piece of paper of postcard dimensions, with a photograph and titled Official ID with an unreadable round stamp. The Swede knew the docks very well and the harbor itself, particularly the shortcuts which avoided all the checkpoints.
Der Führer hat mich zu seinem Nachfolger bestimmt. Im Bewusstsein der Verantwortung.
He behaved as if he had lived here permanently, not like someone who came twice a year, as he told the Norwegians. The sleeping guard was not there by coincidence.
Meine erste Aufgabe ist es,
The Swede's plan was simple. He could not take them on board immediately, as it would have been too risky. They were supposed to hide in a box carriage and wait there until he gave them a sign with a torch from the ship. Then they would get closer, and he was to show them how to get on the ship. While the sergeant was peering through the darkness to see the light from the ship, he suddenly heard footsteps in the distance and a knocking on the carriage door. The lieutenant had no doubts that it was a German patrol. The only question was whether they were going to look inside the carriage. It was too late to shut the door now. The Norwegians could smell the smoke of cigarettes. The Germans unfortunately decided to have a break in front of their carriage. In the distance, they could hear the siren of a departing ship, probably with their Swede. It was midnight. The lieutenant tried to collect the thoughts running around his head. They did not know the harbor, and they had entered the place without passes. They could not remember all the paths along which the Swede led them. The carriage was no solution at all. It would be difficult to hide here during the day. About 3 a.m., the sergeant began to show the first signs of hypothermia. Jens felt seriously cold too. They had a feeling that their shivering was heard throughout the whole area of the harbor. Paranoia was slowly taking control. Something had to be done. Another patrol could appear again at any second. The lieutenant's plan was to go back to the old town and find the French brothel. He hoped the French girls would be willing to help them. All in all, they had got to know one another a bit. It was possible that the madam was helping to smuggle the escapees. They also had to stay overnight somewhere to recover. Now they looked miserable and cold. It could easily bring trouble. The lieutenant wanted to grab a streak of luck. They wanted to get out through the checkpoint and pretend to be workers that had just finished a night shift. When they got there, unfortunately, there was another guard, and he was not asleep. He was strangely friendly, and he didn't ask for the papers. The lieutenant realized that this was the streak of luck which they needed so much now to recover and continue the great escape. The internal newspaper reported the arrest of 65 escapees. They were arrested mainly at train stations. Because 15 of them were still not caught, intense search was advised. Everywhere within the Great Manhunt area. The day was dawning when they reached the Kleiner Otterstrasse, absolutely frozen to the bone. The French brothel was shut. They knocked for a long time, hoping that someone would open the door and let them sleep somewhere. They were thinking for a second whether it was not a dream. Those women and the Swede were so unreal in that gloomy and miserable place. They could not attract any attention now. Although it was rather difficult to walk along the same street without making someone suspicious, they had to pretend they knew where they were going and did it with strong confidence. Jens was looking around when he suddenly saw a patrol in the tram. The tiredness must have weakened his alertness because he could not remember them getting on. He had a thought that he could knock them down, but on the tram there could have been some undercover Gestapo men. Besides, the sergeant was exhausted, and such incidents would reveal their presence in town. The only thing they could do now was to hold on to their rising emotions. Suddenly, one of the soldiers noticed someone on the rear deck of the tram. The Germans started to chase the running man. The lieutenant felt strange gratitude. It was very possible the stranger saved them from being arrested. So far, they had been extremely lucky. Nearby, they found a little hotel, as if forgotten by people. They could feel the nice warmth of a fireplace. This is exactly what they needed: peace and some sleep. The owner was a suspicious man, difficult to convince. The German examined them carefully, and it was obvious that he was really surprised by what he had seen. They were different mechanical words. The lieutenant added that they were mechanics. It took him a long time. The sergeant started to feel afraid of the German. He suggested that they look for somewhere else to stay. The lieutenant knew it would be difficult and dangerous. The German obviously didn't want to lose customers, so finally he took them upstairs and showed them to their rooms. They asked the owner to wake them up at 5:30 in the afternoon. This was the suitable time to look for new Swedes in the house in Kleiner Orrestrasse. In the meantime, other members of the Great Escape reached Szczecin. An Englishman, Wing Commander Harry Day, and First Officer Pavel Tobolski.
My dear Mrs. Tobolski, I regret I have not written to you before, but I have no excuse except that I had hoped to be able to give you more details after I had spoken to others who might have seen your husband. I had better introduce myself. I am Wing Commander Day, and your husband was my companion on the escape in 1944. To begin, your husband and I became companions because both of us had decided to make it to Szczecin and neither wanted to go there direct, but by Berlin in order to throw the German police off the scent. On the night of the escape, all those who were going out collected in the barracks where the tunnel started from. I was dressed as a civilian and your husband as an airman in the German Air Force. His disguise was very good indeed. It was made up from RAF uniforms made by prisoners in the camp. We were numbers 30 and 31 to go through the tunnel. While we were down there, an air raid warning must have been announced, as the electrical lights all went out and we were left in the dark. After I had got clear of the tunnel entrance and crept out of sight of the German sentry into the woods, I waited for your husband. We spent one day in Berlin. My Danish friend helped us. We decided to go on to Szczecin, where your husband has a sister whom he hoped to see and who could perhaps help us. Our tickets from Berlin were to throw the German police off the scent.
Tobolski decided to visit his sister on his own. He thought it would be safer. His Luftwaffe uniform and good ID papers gave him confidence. Her house, which was in a remote part of the city, was untouched. In her last letter after they had lost touch, she mentioned that she had married a German. She met him before the war, moving to German Szczecin, as did hundreds of Poles looking for a job. Tobolski decided that if her husband opened the door, he will say that he mistook the address. His absent-mindedness was broken by sudden voices. The girls were probably hurrying to a meeting or a date. The energy of the youth seemed to be against all odds of the war. For a while, Tobolski found himself in a different world. One he remembered from the past, a world which was now in tatters.
Pisałam, żebyś nie przyjeżdżał. Jest wojna. Śniłeś mi się dziś w nocy. Bardzo się bałam. Teraz też się boję. Oni są wszędzie. Wszystko wywężą. Wybacz.
About 2 hours later, your husband came to the pub and said that she could not help us in any way. It was very essential that we got shelter, for it was well below freezing point. We decided we must try and we must contact someone, preferably a Pole. Eventually, as a last resort, I contacted a POW. Nearly all the French POWs were allowed to walk about in their towns and countryside as long as they reported back to their camp each night. The man said he could shelter us into a room in the factory where there were other Frenchmen. Our friend said that all the other Frenchmen in there were friends.
Between 1939 and 1945, in Szczecin, there were over 100 different Nazi-forced labor camps. They housed about 15,000 Polish workers and the same number from Western countries and the Soviet Union. There were also labor camps for POWs. There were Italians, Russians, and French.
The next morning there was a great commotion, and 2 men in uniform waving rifles came in, shouting for the 2 Tommies. As we were there in the corner of the room, without any outlet, we were completely trapped. So, in view of the rifles, there was nothing to do but give in. We were very disappointed. I got to know your husband very well in those days we spent together. He never let me see how hard he must have felt it. He was always cheerful, and he set a great example even in the worst periods when we were in the cell together. He was unselfishness personified and always wanted to give up the best place or biggest bit of food. I know how you must feel to have lost such a gallant and good man.
The Englishman Harry Day survived the capture because he was a member of a well-known family. He escaped successfully again. The Pole, Paul Tobolski, was secretly executed. The order Stufe 3 was invented to deceive the Prisoners of War International Organization and to falsify documents. The order was supplemented with an executive order, Kugel Irrles, the action bullet. Those who were caught were not entered on the camp lists. They were driven toward their previous camp and shot on the way, explaining the death by an attempt to escape. The action bullet was to be a solution for mass escapees. RAF pilots Jan Müller and Sergeant Per Bergsland were still free. After an unlucky attempt, they got out from the harbor early morning and went to the city again to find a hotel. A few hours of sleep and a warm bath gave them new strength. When they heard some sailors speaking Swedish, they did not think too long. They knew their time was running short, and that could be their last chance. They told their men their whole story of the Great Escape and asked for help. Their story impressed the Swedes so much that they decided to help them despite a sleepless night and a hangover. During World War II, Szczecin was an important smuggling trail for escapees from POW camps. Everything was based on contacts with ship crews from neutral countries which docked in Szczecin. The Norwegians had been lucky so far. They managed to get in touch with Swedish sailors without any dangerous intermediaries. Lieutenant Müller was now thinking of one thing only: whether their names are on the hunt list. How much do the Germans know? They could see the Swedish ship in the distance, but unfortunately, there was a German soldier talking to his fellow. The initial idea was to arrange passes for the Norwegians. They were to pretend to be old friends who met the Swedes on the land, but quickly decided to change their mind and pretend to be a drunk, jolly, and noisy team. The idea worked. The Germans wanted rid of them as quickly as possible. Thanks to Swedish sausage and some beer, the tension had finally started to let off, and the chance for freedom started to take shape. The sailors hid them in the bow of the ship in the anchor compartment. They thought it was the best place to hide, as the Germans did not check this place during customs control. As soon as the Norwegians got into the place, they knew exactly why the Germans never checked this place. Cold, damp, and the smell of engine lubricants brought the worst memories of the previous night which they had spent in the box carriage. Whatever circumstances, they had to get some sleep to be strong enough to face the obstacles the next day. Sagenbefehl, Sagenorder, secret instructions for the Gestapo stations within the area where the escapees were captured. The order informed about the escaped prisoners who were a threat for the internal safety of the Reich, as the incident impeded on the transport system and engaged military units as well as civilians in the search. Previous precautions being taken to this point had not brought satisfactory outcomes. To stop further escapes, Hitler ordered executing the captured POWs. In the morning, to the Swedes' surprise, a different officer came than usual. They knew immediately that he was looking for something or someone. He seemed to be exaggerating with details, and this could bring nothing but trouble. When all seemed successful, he insisted on taking a look at the last place he had not checked yet. The Swede tried to hide his terror and lingered with finding the keys. He knew that the situation was hopeless. Opening the anchor compartment was not a good solution. He was just trying to gain some time. Nothing else came to his mind. Suddenly, a soldier ran onto the deck with an urgent message for the officer. The soldier reported to the officer about a man captured near the ship. The stranger was no one important, but it saved the Norwegian's life. After a couple of hours sea trip, Jens and Per were in Sweden, finally free. A British consul from Gothenburg transferred them to Stockholm, where they were looked after at the embassy. The airmen sent letters to their comrades in the camp. Hiding their real identity, they confirmed the success of the escape. The third lucky one was a Dutch, Bram van der Stok, who escaped to Breslau and then to Spain. Thanks to many years of investigation, the names of 72 people responsible for the execution and realization of the criminal order Sagenorder were found.